Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest of SCI's online talks, which are looking at the cutting edge of science and industry. This Sci talk is looking at why cell and gene therapy is the future of medicine. Just a few words about SCI. SCI's mission is to accelerate the rate of adoption of scientific innovation for the benefit of society. And this Sci talk is part of SCI's public outreach. My name is Steve Ranger. I'm the editor-in-chief of SCI, which means I'm responsible for the monthly science magazine, Chemistry and Industry, and the daily science and industry news we publish as well. The magazine is a member benefit of SCI, so if you aren't already a member, please do consider joining. I'm also the chair of today's session, so I'll be in charge of the housekeeping and the such like. Little bit of that housekeeping right now. We very much encourage questions for the speaker today. During the session, everyone's mics are muted, but please do drop questions into the question box at any time, and then we can address them at the end. Otherwise, all attendees will be in listen-only mode. These side talks are about exploring some of the most important issues in science. And for this session, I'm delighted to be joined by Matthew Durdy, Chief Exec of the Cell and Gene Therapy Catapult. Matthew will be talking about how cell and gene therapy could deliver remarkable innovation for patient health. And beyond the benefits to the individual, these new treatments could also have huge and far-reaching impacts for the broader healthcare system. I'm really interested in this topic. I've been chatting to Matthew about it before. It sounds absolutely fascinating. So, Matthew, over to you for what I'm sure will be an absolutely fascinating talk.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for attending, and thank you for the SCI for giving us this opportunity to speak. My name is Matthew Durdy. I'm the Chief Executive of the Cell and Gene Therapy Catapult. And what I would like to do is basically, and I've been tasked to do, is to give you some insight into the cell and gene therapy industry as it is emerging. My involvement with cell and gene therapy really kicked off about 20 years ago. And then 15 years ago, 2012, I was asked to get involved with the creation of a new kind of institute that would help the industry develop. But before I kick into too much of that, I just want to give you a sense of what cell and gene therapy is. Because cell and gene therapy are often used together, but they're actually they're different modalities with a very similar aim. Cell therapy is where you're intending to replace the cells in the body, so it does what it says on the tin. And gene therapy is where you're attempting to modify the genetic information within the cell itself in order to change its behavior. The two modalities can be used in combination. Sometimes you have gene-modified cell therapies, but they also quite often found separately. Where they share some commonality is the intent with which they are used is to modify the disease, ideally a cure, but certainly a change in the pathway of disease. Very often there is an intensity of activity in one place, a single dose that results off quite often in an intensity of cost as well, and we'll come back to that a bit later. But with that goes the expectation of a long duration of effect, and it is these three things that actually make cell and gene therapy fantastically beneficial for patients, but quite problematic for healthcare systems because they're really not set up for large amounts of therapeutics of this kind of character. And we'll touch on some of those things as we go through. So back in 2012, in the era where people still wore ties and people met in rooms for presentations such as this, I would be standing on a platform talking about cell and gene therapy. It's the next big thing. Get ready, everybody. And the kind of responses that I would get, either individually or collectively, would be, it won't work. You won't be able to make it. The regulators are never going to let you put that into people. Nobody's going to want it. And even if it does all work, No one will pay you for it. And a lot of this relates to the fact that what we're talking about here is something that is highly variable, basically. It is in some form, a biological agent that has the capacity to reproduce in some cases, either the cell or the genetic information. And therefore, variability and control are important questions in the use of cell and gene therapies. Things that are not familiar to the old regulatory and manufacturing algorithms or norms. So I'd like to just examine some of those a little bit and see how much truth there really was in them. So it won't work. At the same time that I was standing on a platform, this young lady, Emily Whitehead, had just failed her, or the second round of chemotherapy had failed her, and her parents were taken to one side and told to spend time with her. You know, that she had weeks, possibly months left to live. The doctors have run out of treatment options and said, "We're sorry, but you know, we have a hard message to deliver and a hard message to receive. Please spend more time with her." A few weeks later, the parents are back in the University of Pennsylvania hospital, and the academic said, "Well, there is a colleague of ours who is running a clinical trial. Um, she qualifies for the trial. We're not recommending it. We're just letting you know that it exists." And of course, the parents jumped at the opportunity because they had no other options. And that's quite an important part of the development of the industry, this sort of high risk, high return environment. And there's a whole story to tell, which I'm not going to try and tell today, about what happened next. And maybe another time I can talk about that, or you can go and look at it. But it's a real insight into the importance and the brilliance of clinicians, and the importance of flexibility, the importance of being in a place where alternative drugs exist, and the importance of keeping the lawyers out of the process as well, because people had to be flexible. But long story short, Emily left that hospital about 9 days later, cancer-free. And that was the beginning of an extraordinary period for cell and gene therapy. Uh, Emily was one of 3 patients that were treated in the trial before Novartis came along and invested $150 million into this particular type of therapeutic, and it kicked off a whole round of investment across the world. We will come back to Emily and her story perhaps a little bit later. So you won't be able to make it. Bear in mind that the manufacturing of a drug is a highly controlled process. And if you think about something like paracetamol, you see on the left-hand side here the classic categories of GMP release criteria for a conventional drug, if you like. You know, identity, content, purity, uniformity, how well it dissolves, and how clean it is. And my colleagues in the industry will murder me when they see this, but I could characterize the release criteria at the time as, did you change anything? And does it look the same? Because the mantra at the time was, the process is the product. So if you changed anything to do with the process, you were essentially changing the product. That's an extremely difficult and challenging way to run a manufacturing process and release drugs that are going to go into patients. But you saw the clinical effect earlier on. That precipitated huge amounts of investment, and the world has moved on. Now the question from a manufacturing perspective is, how do we manufacture the kind of quantities at the price point that will meet the demand from patients and the health hospital system for these therapeutics today? And as innovation comes in and brings down the cost of goods, the demand just grows. It's like any technology cycle. The more that is done, the cost comes down, the more the demand goes up, and cell and gene therapy is caught in that today. The amount of innovation with respect to control, release, purity. If you've got a genetic drug, for instance, you've got to have mechanisms to determine whether or not there are any abnormalities within the changes that you've made, et cetera, et cetera. All of that has come on tremendously over the last 10 years, which means that we're producing products today that have a lower risk profile and therefore can move into lower risk disease areas as well. And we'll see a little bit more about that as we move on. However, it's not so plain sailing. For those of you that think that cell and gene therapy is going the way of synthetic chemistry in terms of its control, I just want to drop in a little warning here. This is a headline from a paper that was produced from some work which was brought to my attention by Bruce Levine, who's one of the great leaders in this space, a few years before this paper was actually published. He was looking, or they were looking at the delays in response in some of the patients that were having drugs very similar to the ones that treated Emily. And in one case, the delay was 50 days before there was an effect. And bear in mind that Emily left about 9 days after she was treated. And it turned out that they traced that patient's response back to a single cell that was in the mix of cells that was given to that patient. So that raises all sorts of questions about what's the role of purity, what's the role of control, what's the importance of variability in biological medicines. I'm not going to try and answer any of those. I'm just going to leave it with you that it's a much more complicated question when you're dealing with biology. Okay, so takeaways from this section from my point of view, the process is not the product. If anybody ever says to you, the process is the product, challenge them. Challenge them and say to them, are we really in a place where you know so little about what you're producing and how you're producing it that you are unable to tell whether a change that you have made has changed what comes out at the end of it? Because if that is the case, that is an admission of failure. And I like to think, and I believe that the industry has moved on enormously since those very early days. The second is that as these are quite complex and drugs to manufacture and require quite a lot of infrastructure, both in terms of the product development and the manufacturing infrastructure. Scale is extremely important in terms of the cost structure, and that we'll come back to the relationship between scale and cost and the size of the market a little bit later on as well. But now we're in a period where people are working on how they can deliver at volume, and that is extremely positive in terms of the technology cycle. And then the last point is the one I just mentioned, which is product quality is not as simple as you think it is. The regulators. So, people say the regulators will never let you put that into people. Actually, the regulators were extremely important in the development of the industry. They engaged with the concept very, very quickly. A lot of the drugs in the space, partly because of the regulatory pressures, but also from a practical perspective, were developed in areas of extremely high unmet need, which meant that the risk-reward relationship was very positive if you were coming forward with a therapeutic that might work with these patients. If you take the Emily example, clearly anything that had a reasonable prospect of success could be a good thing to do. So a large number of trials actually took place not in healthy volunteers, because that was not appropriate, but in patients who had very few other therapeutic options. And that also meant that a phase 1 trial, which typically would be a safety trial, was actually also a safety and efficacy trial because it was going into patients who had the disease. And then the second point was that the therapeutics were going into patients who had very few other options. So the outcomes quite often were quite binary. You had a control group who were may die if you had a control group. You might have a historical group that you looked at, and you had a treatment group who were having incredibly high efficacy rates, 60, 70, 80, in some cases 90% survival rates. That made the results quite appealing to the regulators, but also to the industry, and resulted in the growth of the industry. It also caused some problems down the road, which perhaps you might not anticipate. If you are familiar with the mathematics of power in clinical trials calculations, it's related to the size of the clinical effect. In other words, you need more patients for a smaller clinical effect. So if you have a very strong clinical effect, like a binary outcome, then you don't need many patients to show statistical efficacy, which is what drives the regulatory decisions. So you could actually run a pivotal trial with 30 patients, perhaps, which is great. It means that things come through extremely quickly through the development process. But it also means the product has not been tried in a wide group of the population. And that turns out to be something that was not a barrier for the regulators, but a barrier for the payers, actually, because people were being asked to believe in results in a wider population. Don't just to give you a sense of how much the regulators indulged the industry, these rather scary diagrams, you don't need to read the words, just look at the dots. The outer dots are phase 1 clinical trials, and as you move in, you go through pivotal trials, through registration to marketed products. You'll see there's a handful of marketed products in the center and an enormous amount of products at the outside working their way in. These figures are from 2022. It will have thinned out a little bit since then, but it gives you a sense of the fact that the regulators are definitely not getting in the way of the development of the industry, and that there is an enormous amount of investment going in. You can't do it on these slides, but if you get to analyze this data, what you will also see, and this will be repeated in some of the subsequent slides, that there are lots of trials in each therapeutic area, which bodes well for competition down the road, and also for innovation for that matter. Just to take that idea that the regulators are a facilitator one stage further, this is a more recent development in the space, which has been made, I believe, made possible by the kinds of developments that the regulators allowed in those early years of development, where they understood and got comfortable with understanding fully the risk-reward relationship of early clinical trials for novel and innovative medicines, which may themselves be dangerous, not dangerous, but they may carry some risk, but where there was already considerable risk to the patient because of their condition. This baby, I believe, is baby KJ, who was treated with a therapeutic that was developed as a therapeutic of 1, and it was given on the basis of a plausible method of action. And it's probably a little bit too early to tell, but every indication is that this was highly successful treatment of this child. So you're now looking at therapeutics where the therapeutic is developed and given to the patient without going through the conventional trialing process, because you can't, because there aren't enough patients to run a clinical trial, and the patient hasn't got enough time for you to go through that process anyway. This is an extraordinary development. The idea that we can use historical information, our knowledge, and access all of that we know to make decisions about the plausibility of effect bodes extremely well for the treatment of disease in the future, particularly rare disease. And the other point here, although I list the 3 agencies on this slide, one of the reasons why this has come about is partly because of the cooperation and collaboration between these agencies, but also because of competition between agencies. regulation has become a source of global competition or competitiveness for countries that are trying to capture these amazing new industries that are being developed and the changes in healthcare that come with them. So takeaways from this section, from my perspective, the regulators are not the problem. We are entering a very exciting era of the use of knowledge in the past. Don't have to keep repeating everything every single time. Building and sharing the knowledge that we have is the challenge. We're not set up as an industry to readily share, and the information is incredibly fragmented. And part of the role of organizations like ours and the regulators will be to facilitate that sharing of knowledge in a safe way. And then the last point, which I haven't really touched on, I won't go on too much in the rest of the presentation, is that there was a popular misconception that you were doing clinical trials for the regulator. Actually, the regulator's responsibility is to ensure safety and efficacy. But the point that we always make to people in this space is the regulators have no intention of ever buying your product. If you are building data, you are building data for the payer, for the healthcare system, and for the customer to ensure efficacy and safety and cost effectiveness. So on the question of no one will pay you, I just want to talk through the economics a bit, because the sticker price for many of these therapeutics, in other words, what people see when they see the cost, it can be in the millions. So some of these, I've got some prices later on, but you know, £1-2 million for a therapeutic, and everybody goes, "Well, it's just never going to work. That's not it." But actually, let's just talk briefly about Matthew Harrington. He's a patient who was treated a few years ago now. He's the adult in that picture, and he's quoted as saying, "I never think about haemophilia. It's just awesome." Now, if any of you have ever met or lived with haemophilia, and I grew up with one at school, that was all he ever thought about, is the pain of his condition and the restrictions of his condition. So to be treated and have that taken away and to return to a normal, productive life is an extraordinary thing. If he hadn't been treated with the gene therapy, the lifetime cost of treating him, just with the factor VIII, was roughly a couple $100,000 a year, or up to $15 million over his lifetime, or £10 million over his lifetime. That's an extraordinary cost. If I came to you with a therapeutic that was a one-off treatment and said, for £3 million, I will take away that £10 million worth of cost and free up hospital resource and enable this patient to re-enter the productive workforce, that would sound like quite a good deal. And when you look at, well, I'll come on the next slide, some of the therapeutics that have been approved by NICE in the UK. The table on the right-hand side is some of the early analysis of the macroeconomics, if you like, but it's restricted to the healthcare costs. And it basically, what they did is they said, if we took all the drugs that are available in 2019 and applied them to the populations, hematological populations in the US, how long would it take to get a payback? And the answer was, it takes about 5 years to get to break even. And over the next 5 years, you get about 1.5 times your original investment back. That actually is not a bad return on investment for healthcare. And bear in mind, the effect goes on well beyond those 10 years. But our systems are not designed to think in 10-year periods. Our systems are designed to think in 1-year periods. And so they get stuck in that diagram, the 2020 bar, which says spend $24 billion. And that's part of the changes to the system that we have been trying to bring about in order to facilitate the growth of the industry. This table, again, probably quite hard to read, so don't worry too much about it. It just lists 4 therapeutics that are 4 of the therapeutics, not the entire group, that are available for regular use in the NHS in England. On the right-hand side, which is what I want to illustrate, is what I describe as the sticker price. It's the list price of the drugs, as far as we know. That's probably not the price that the NHS is paying, but it gives you a sense of this. It's almost certainly not the price the NHS is paying, but it gives you a sense of the scale um, of the price. And bear in mind that these drugs will have been analyzed through the NICE health technology assessment mechanism in some degree, to a large degree of accuracy or systematically, and deemed to be delivering value for the price that the NHS is paying, that they are delivering value to the healthcare system and to the patients. Which means that actually we are in a position where these large prices can be recognized or partially recognized as delivering value in the long term for the healthcare system. This doesn't get over the budgetary issues that the healthcare system faces in terms of assessing the amount that they have to pay up front and the 10 years that they need to recoup that cost, track the patients, because patients who have be made to feel well don't readily come back to hospitals, and therefore all the tracking systems break down and all sorts of things that are future problems that we are seeking to overcome. But in terms of no one will pay you for it, there are now blockbusters in the space, and there are increasing numbers of therapeutics coming through to achieve blockbuster status. For those that are not familiar with the term blockbuster, it applies to a drug which is marketed, which achieves over $1 billion in revenues in a year. Excuse me. I should credit for several of the next slides the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, and disclose that I am a director of the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, which is a US-based global lobbying body for the industry. But I have borrowed some of their slides. Okay, so we've kind of got over those initial questions. Where's the industry going? And the next slides will give you a sense of that. Firstly, a lot of those therapeutics, many of the successful therapeutics, were in the area of hematological cancer, liquid cancers. There's a huge amount of work going into solid cancers. So another great growth area, and another amazing area for patient benefit. The other thing to note that in the numbers on the horizontal bars are numbers of trials in each one of those different indications, which bodes well for a competitive environment between these therapeutics at some point down the road. But it's not just cancer. There's a huge amount of work now going into autoimmune disease, which is a much bigger indication. And also note that the risk profile changes a bit. I mean, autoimmune disease can be extremely serious, but it has a different risk profile from cancer. So we've got whole new categories of growth. But also across many, many areas: eye disease, neurological diseases, Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, diabetes. There are new therapeutics coming through to the market. These are very large indications. And if we play back up to the manufacturing challenge that was described earlier on, to meet the needs of these patients, we've really got to get to highly systemized, highly accurate, and highly reliable manufacturing. I'll just make a couple of points that I didn't include in my slides about where the industry is going into from a therapeutic perspective. Clearly, it's going into more indications. Wherever it can, it tries to go into doing the treatment inside the body in vivo, to, if you like, do the manufacturing inside the body as a way of reducing cost and reducing some degree of risk. It also introduces some complications. So there have been several attempts to do this. Some of them will be successful, some of them will not. But you also see more flexibility in the manufacturing coming through. So we've got a sort of a narrowing of patient groups potentially, particularly in rare diseases, as I alluded to with the baby KJ example earlier on, which means that you could get to if you like, a mass personalization of therapeutics where drugs are manufactured to order according to the patient's um, cancer, particular genetic condition. It's some way down the road for us to be there, but the conventional barriers to that in terms of technology, scale, cost, and regulator participation have dropped away a lot over the last few years, and therefore they are conceivable. And all of these things will massively increase the volume of throughput through the entire system, the development system, the usage system, the manufacturing system, and the hospital system, which brings down the cost of goods. So faced with all of that, governments need to make a decision as to whether they are going to look at that sticker price I talked before, the £1 million, the £2 million for a therapeutic, and say, we can't have this, we need to get away from it, or whether they're going to embrace it and bring in the technological cycle, which means you go to bigger volume, greater innovation, and therefore the cost of goods comes down as it does in any other technological cycle like your mobile phones. And I would argue that the Europeans, the EU, have gone for the evade option. They are trying to use every tool they can to prevent things like the data from single arm trials being used acceptably for payment or licensing decisions. I would argue that the US has gone to the opposite end and basically said, well, this is just the most amazing way to revolutionize healthcare. How do we encourage it? How do we help? And I would say that the UK is still making its mind up as to which way it will go, and I will play our part in getting them to embrace the sector. I think the natural inclination is to do that. But obviously our NHS has a few things to deal with. In that context, we went out and said, if you really need to change the system in order to embrace healthcare, in order to bring this new kind of healthcare system in, you need to know that it's going to be beneficial. So we have developed with the Office of Health Economics a novel way of assessing the macroeconomics of innovative therapeutics, and applied it to. We basically used the UK Treasury Green Book, which is their standard way of analysing an investment, to analyse the investment in cell and gene therapies, and then applied it in the first instance to 4 differing products or product groups or indications. And I will summarize the outputs of this to basically say there are some limitations to the model because it's a 10-year model. So if you treat children, they don't enter the productive workforce within that 10-year period, so you don't pick up the benefits from it. But if you take some of the things like beta thalassemia, which I'll touch on a bit later, the magnitude of the benefit to the economy as a whole is as big as the benefit to the individuals in that treatment area. And that's also true with Alzheimer's, although there isn't actually any marketed drug for Alzheimer's at the moment. So there is a good reason for society, for governments to invest in embracing and enabling the healthcare system changes associated with bringing in cell and gene therapies, or ATMPs as they're known in Europe. So no one will want it. Now, this is an area where I think there's much more work to be done. And I just want to acknowledge the importance of bringing patients and the general population with us as we develop this industry. We've tried, but the industry is moving extremely quickly, and I think we can do more. I'm going to give a slightly complex example. I could give you lots of examples of patients who are desperate to get treated, and I can give you lots of examples of patients who have been treated and are very comfortable with it. This is a case of a patient who's a beta thalassemia patient who I have spent, I've had the privilege of talking to and interviewing. And it has a number of interesting dimensions to it. So the first is he's part of a group, a patient group in Wales, and he's older. Some of them are younger. The younger patients don't want a gene therapy. They're not ready for it. There are some side effects which they want to avoid. Um, and there is some stigma attached to being, that's why there's a picture of his mother there, because the mother was concerned that her son was in some way different. He's very open and has been a great champion for the indication and also for gene therapy. But the real twist in this is that the clinical trial took place on patients in their late teens through to the age of 35. He's 43, which means as far as the NHS is concerned, he's outside the bounds from which they have information about the efficacy of the drug. And so although he is, as active a football player as you can be for somebody that's got beta thalassemia and is remarkably healthy and extremely bright, they're basically saying you can't have it because you're outside of the boundaries of the information we have. There's all sorts in that, which we haven't got time to go into now, but it was a real lesson for us as people who are involved in the development of drugs to make sure you put the boundaries of the clinical trial in the right place, at least. I think there's also an argument that he should qualify for the drug, but that's for others to decide. Although it's clear what I encourage. So in the question of patients, we've got to bring them with us. We've got to do more work. We've got to get more understanding of, clearly, the more the therapies are used, the better that understanding will become. So that brings me towards the end of my talk. I'm sorry, it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour through cell and gene therapy. But my takeaway messages are cell and gene therapy is real, it's here, it transforms lives. We have a maturing industry. I would say it's not mature because it's growing at an incredible rate and it is developing its technologies at an incredible rate, particularly with respect to manufacturing. But there's a whole hospital and healthcare related change that needs to come through. Demand goes up, volume goes up, competition is present in the system. That will drive innovation. It will also drive costs down over time. Innovation and reduced cost means that more lives are transformed and you end up in a virtuous circle. We still need to bring the patients with us, as you mentioned. The roles of the regulator has been very much facilitating, and they continue to keep up with the industry, or at least pretty close to the industry. But also that the state in this case has a very big role to play, because many of the benefits that will be reaped from this form of healthcare, this change to healthcare, relates to productivity and wider society as a whole. And therefore, the money that is used to facilitate its growth should not just come from the healthcare budget. It could also come from other parts of the state funding mechanisms. And I will give the very last word to Emily. Thank you very much.
So that's absolutely brilliant. Thank you, Matthew. That's been an absolutely fascinating talk. And I've absolutely learned huge amounts there. One of the questions that I'd like to ask probably goes right back to the start, where you talked about 2012, when people used to wear ties and all sorts of old-fashioned things like that. Where was all of this resistance to cell and gene therapy coming from? I think you've done a really great job of explaining all the different elements of it. But what was it, just that it was just such a new area of science and a new area of understanding that just people just didn't understand it, or was there something else going on there?
It relates to uncertainty and variability. The it does go back to the regulators to some extent, because the regulators at that time influenced the way that people believed that they could develop drugs and what they could develop drugs for. And the regulatory system was developed around small compounds, small molecules. And therefore it was all about consistency, safety, lack of variability, and control. And you can't have all of those things with something that you want to reproduce itself in somebody's body. And therefore we had to get to a stage where you could at least very clearly say, look, it can work. It can work spectacularly well, which allowed things to move. And I genuinely think that Emily was a big part of that.
Thanks for that. How do you think, I mean, you kind of touched on this as well, the economics will play out over the next few years? Because I think what really struck me was you often see stories in the about the huge cost of a new treatment, but what really came to me through what you were saying was often you do not hear about firstly the benefits and also the potential savings, right? You don't hear about that lifetime of savings that could come out the other end of it. How do you see all of that playing out over the next few years, as far as you can see?
So I think it depends on a national level whether people embrace it or evade it. If you evade it, okay, then we will be stuck in the rut of ever increasing healthcare costs that we're in now and ever decreasing national productivity. If you embrace it, um, you've got much better outcomes for patients in those areas where the therapeutics show that. You have a ability for those patients to return to productive work and their carers, importantly, in a lot of cases. But also you have an impact upon the hospital system. If a lot of the hospital system is geared up to patients returning on a periodic basis, monthly, quarterly, whatever it might be, for checkups and further treatments, changes to their drugs, new prescriptions, whatever it might be. If you have curative intent, you free up enormous amounts of that resource in the healthcare system because those patients don't need to come back as frequently. They still need checkups. And that gives you the wiggle room to change the way healthcare is done. So I think there is the potential there to open up a complete revolution in healthcare.
I mean, how much of that thinking is being done already, or is that something that's starting to be factored into, not necessarily immediately into budgets, but into sort of longer term planning?
So there's no doubt that I don't think it's in the planning yet because I don't think you can plan for it until you can see the parameters of how it happens. But I'd certainly been involved. In fact, yesterday I was involved in a conversation with a government minister where that's clearly what they would like to do, and they're looking for the ways to do it. So I think it is, if it can be done, now is the time for it to be done.
Mm. I've also got a question about the science. Is there any particular element of the science that is still lacking or in development, or that kind of like needs to be pushed forward, in comparison to the rest of the kind of like the sort of the general innovation going on there? Is there one area that's sort of like lacking, or you're waiting on a big sort of leap forward?
Um, uh, I would say that it's a very rapidly moving area in all areas. Okay, so what I say today will be, fine tomorrow. However, the one area that I think is dominant in this space that I think we overestimate, and this is a personal view, overestimate our ability is our control over the immune system and our relationship with the immune system. And I do apologize to those people that read the brief because I saw it as I opened up the screen around what I would be talking about because it implied that I'd be talking more about the science, but I think I've steered away from that a little bit. Um, the immune system is extremely important in all of these drugs, both from a point of view of efficacy, because in some cases we are harnessing the immune system, um, or re-guiding it, redirecting it. In another case, because it reduces efficacy. But so in the case of the CAR Ts, they have to use the most effective currently where they use the patient's own cells because the patient's own cells are not attacked by the immune system. That makes manufacturing and the cost of goods extremely high and hard. If you could use mass-produced cells and put them in a way that they could evade the immune system, then it would bring the costs down quite dramatically and give you much more flexibility. We haven't managed to crack that one yet. So that would be the real one if we, but it's a big ask. Yeah, a very big ask.
Right. Okay. Another question in kind of the same sort of area, but you obviously talked about cancer and autoimmune potential. Is there broader potential beyond that for cell and gene therapies that hasn't really been tapped into yet? Because I think we tend to think of it as being very particularly targeted, but I also sense that you're talking about it getting broader and broader as well in terms of its potential.
Yeah, and I think that over time it will naturally broaden out into larger indications. To be honest, there are very few things that I've come across where somebody hasn't suggested a cell therapy or a gene therapy of some sort. Um, the speed of the progress will be related to a number of things. One is our scientific understanding of both the disease and our therapeutics, which is developing very rapidly. The second is our experience of those things so that we understand the risk profiles. And thirdly, the cost of goods, because as you go out into more prevalent populations, A, there are often therapeutic alternatives, and B, the scale of the therapeutic need is often not as of such a great magnitude, and therefore there is less economic value in the treatment, and therefore your cost of goods comes. So if you're going to go into some of the highly prevalent things, you need to have a much lower cost of goods. That will all come as the industry grows, but it will be a gradual progression outwards into those areas.
Okay. And in terms of, say, the research in this area and the companies working on it, is there something that is there one thing you could fix to help, give them a kickstart to make sure that the therapies are, given a good chance to succeed in the market? Or is there actually quite a lot of research here and enough investment flowing through that actually is quite buoyant?
There's massive amounts of investment and research going on. The thing that I would fix, I did mention in the talk, which is and this is again a big ask, but it's a really possible and doable ask, and it's the role of um, state intervention to do this. Global state intervention cooperation is the way that we pool and share and use data. If you're going to go into a world where we are able to make therapeutic decisions based upon our best use of the knowledge we have, we need to make sure that we have as much knowledge as possible. It's out there, there's huge amounts out there, and now we've got an era of artificial intelligence that allows us to create engines to interpret and understand that data in large quantities. What we need is a way that everybody has access to that data that still enables a competitive environment in which people can make money out of it.
Brilliant. Well, look, that's all of the questions answered as well, and I think we've taken an awful lot of your time. So let me just say thank you again to you, Matthew, for coming along and giving this fantastic talk, and thank you to everyone who's taken the time out of their day to tune in as well. So thank you for that. I just want to mention a couple of things that are coming up. We have more sessions on their way as well. Let me just find the slides for that. And so our next session is going to be on Wednesday, 25th of March, which is looking at hacking the brain's hunger code, miracle menace, or the next stage of human evolution. And after that, we have another one on digital twins. So these are also going to be fascinating sessions, and I'd urge you to sign up for those as well. And also, if you haven't already become a member of SCI, then please do take a look at the membership options and the benefits, as I say, including the monthly magazine, which is called Chemistry and Industry and is a fantastic source of all knowledge about everything to do with science and industry. And with that, I'd say thank you again to Matthew Durdy for taking part in this, and thank you to all for taking part and listening to it. And I hope to see you on another of these again soon. Thank you.